Can I get a Mooney? Can I get a broadband? No? Okay. All right.
For all. Don't forget the for all part. For all.
For everybody. All right. Well, thank you guys. Can you hear us okay? The sound level? Yeah. Okay. I'm Andrea Batista Schlesinger. I'm the Deputy Director of U.S. Programs at Open Society Foundations, and we have an excellent panel. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. That we have, because these are three extraordinary people. So the goal today is to talk about what we can do and what municipalities in particular and what New York in particular can do to expand access. So, you know, Open Society Foundations is interested in this topic both because of what it means to have an open society in which a few companies don't control who has access, but also what the reality of more access to broadband means for places around this country. It means the difference for citizens between access to education and healthcare, to jobs and economic development, or not. So, and I know that this panel is going to get into all of that and shed a lot of wisdom. So, first, you know, I wanted to turn to Andrew Rashay, who's the founder of the Personal Democracy Forum, and, you know, probably single-handedly has done more to bring citywide attention to issues around access and around technology. And can you set the context for everybody about what's at stake when we talk about more access and universal access to broadband?
Well, sure. So information is power. That's a cliche, but still true. And access to the internet and access to broadband provides a currency of information that can help solve problems and bridge the economic, social, and cultural divides between the haves and the have-nots. And New York and the country in general has been woefully behind in understanding that broadband is as important to the success of our country, its education, its economics, its environmental health, as water and electricity were in the industrial age. In some ways, New York actually has it worse than other parts of the city because this is a city that was very successful in the 20th century, and it has an infrastructure that's already set in place. It's a lot easier to run fiber in a trench in an open field in Iowa than it is to run fiber in the streets of New York. So it gets really hard sometimes to try to figure out how you can get this technology distributed equally. There's other problems too, though. There's political problems in that there are companies, incumbent companies in the telco and cable industries that have built systems that make it very, very hard for others to compete. And so in New York, very few people have more than one choice for a broadband provider. But if you were to go to a city like Seoul, South Korea, or to Singapore, people would be able to choose between 5 or 6 providers who would provide not only faster service, but at about a fifth of the cost. So New York has a real great challenge now, but it also has a mayor who has actually made broadband distribution at an equitable level a major policy priority. And there's a lot that New York can do to try to bridge that, to make that happen, to bridge the divide and make that happen. And we're going to hear a little bit from some of the other speakers here, but the key thing to remember is that it's only going to happen through a coalition of people working together. It's not going to happen because of some law that gets passed tomorrow or because of some new technology that comes out tomorrow. This is a big problem that's going to require everybody's help to try to solve.
So I want to turn to Bruce and just, you know, because we have this conversation about broadband, that's one thing. Are we going to be able to run fiber everywhere? But then there's this other kind of question about access. And I want to try to get from this conceptual level of what it would mean for there to be you know, fiber in New York City, and then what it means for particular communities. So Bruce is the executive producer of Silicon Harlem and the executive director of the Silicon Harlem meetup. And so he's the perfect person to ask. So can you talk a little bit, based on your experience with Silicon Harlem, what it would mean to have more broadband access throughout New York?
Well, thanks, Andrew. Silicon Harlem is a social enterprise that focuses on 4 areas that are very important to how we platform ourselves in the 21st century. And the first one, which is integral, is the gigabit infrastructure. If you've seen what's happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or Lafayette, Louisiana, or even in Kansas City with Google Fiber, inputting in that kind of infrastructure gives rise to all sorts of opportunities. And so we want to make sure that Harlem, rather than being the community that gets it last, gets it first, and then leads because of its unique cultural characteristics. And tied into that is the idea that in deploying this next generation internet, we use that to activate an innovation economy in Harlem. And that would include not simply the growth of technology companies, which is what Silicon Harlem is supporting, but as well an increase in STEM literacy and STEM entrepreneurship. And in support of that, we can develop things such as the Apps Youth Leadership Academy, where we can look at Afro-Latino youth who are the highest when it indexes in the use of multimedia, social media, but the adoption of smartphones, and make them the producers of these technologies. So they learn not only how to develop the content, they learn how to build businesses. So what you're looking at is this idea now of technology-driven economic development. So it's not simply the tech startups, it's the mom and pop store. So everyone has to be equitably platformed on these technologies so they can take advantage of these new technologies and is yet to be developed applications. So that's very important. One of the things to keep in mind is, though in some respects we lag in Harlem, in some respects we're in the advance. So we actually have carbon neutral buildings that are smart and green. They're smart and green because we were able to put fiber in those buildings. That's called the sixth utility. So it's not as if there aren't those kind of models. What has to happen is the critical takeoff. As Andrew said, we have to bring together all the key public-private partners who can then make this happen and create this kind of ubiquitous access.
Hey, Bruce, can I just ask you a quick follow-up question? So can you, and this is one thing that I'm trying to get my head around, can you explain to me how the mom and pop store in Harlem would be better off if they had access to fiber? I mean, I understand like the Googles and the rest and how we're not going to get the kind of innovation, but can you say a little bit just to ground it for everybody?
Well, it wouldn't just be the mom and pop store, it would be those mom and pop stores that existed historically who now, say, can't exist within, say, where the current rents are. If they're basically organized as an online cooperative, then all of a sudden you can use the internet to not simply deal with the growth of the changing demographic or tourism, but you have a global audience. So that's why it's so important.
Well, maybe just quickly add that the notion of what a mom and pop is changing. So mom and pop, instead of being a storefront, could be a woman or a man who is a graphic artist who's now selling their services on a global basis, or someone who uses Etsy as a platform because they make things and are able to reach markets now through the internet. So it's the notion of mom and pop is actually changing itself.
Yeah, and what Google Fiber
And let me
found in
introduce
Kansas-
Maya Wiley, who is counsel to Mayor de Blasio. I'm very proud of her. She's running the city, basically, but don't.
I gotta go.
Yeah, exactly. And before that, ran the Center for Social Inclusion, which raised so many of these issues from the outside. So it's so great that you're going to be moving them from the inside. So weigh in here, but then I want to know how the city of New York is thinking about this.
So I just wanted to chime in that, one of the things that Kansas City found with Google Fiber is that suddenly there were all the new mom and pop, which were all these entrepreneurs, essentially people in their homes now that they had digital downloads, high speed, lots of data, innovating tons of new businesses out of their homes. So that's just another example of redefining mom and pop. What I would say about this city, it's really important to think about the role that government plays in critical infrastructure. And broadband is like the water and the electric of the 19th century. Broadband is that for the 21st century. And we didn't get railroads, and we didn't get water and sewer services, and we didn't get electricity without significant government involvement, investment, and policy formation. So I think the role of government is critical here. Some of it is by trying to get more competition into the space. One of the things that we do is we try to use our franchising power and are looking at that to see how we can produce more competition. That's part of what the Verizon franchise agreement for Fios represented. We also got to make sure we hold our franchisees accountable for what they're supposed to deliver under the contracts. But even that's not the end of the story, because examples that Bruce, for instance, is holding up with Silicon Harlem, we have to support the ability for communities, neighborhoods, businesses, entrepreneurs to innovate in order to create an economically sustainable, but also, I would say, a socially, culturally, educationally vibrant city. If you take the public schools, one of the most important programs that we get funded by the federal government for is called E-Rate. And E-Rate is what creates broadband in our public schools. I can tell you that E-Rate is under attack right now There are about 27% of families in the city still don't have internet services at all at home.
What's that number? Say it again.
27%. If you look at people earning $35,000 or less, it's 46%. So what we're talking about is our future, and we're talking about programs that are also existing in public space, not just what's privately available, what people can pay for privately. And we're looking at how we leverage our public schools. We're looking at how we leverage our public libraries to create new innovative models for making sure everybody has high-speed internet access, in addition to working with our private sector partners.
Well, let me give an example from just today. I went and visited the Urban Assembly Gateway School for Technology, met a young lady from East Harlem. She's coding, which is a great thing. So she has a laptop at her school, but when she goes home to 103rd Street and 2nd Avenue, she has to use her phone. So that means she's not able to carry on with the work from the school day where she's in this innovative program, so that there's this disparity between where she goes to school, and thank goodness there's that choice, but when she gets home, she's on her phone. Now think about what that does to her data plan. So we have to figure out how to bring all that into balance.
And one other reason this is important, we know, and I think everyone here, because you're here, knows that 80% of all the new jobs being created over the next decade are going to require STEM skills. We're not getting STEM skills without the technology that helps kids get those skills.
So
That requires broadband.
ready your questions and give me a hand if you have any of them. All right, I'm going to do moderator's privilege, ask one while you warm up, and we're going to get the mic to this gentleman here. We'll get the mic over to you. Okay, while I ask this question. So look, I'm gonna do moderator privilege and then ready you. So Bruce, you mentioned Lafayette, Louisiana, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. I just met those mayors on a panel that we organized last week. You know, the mayor of Lafayette, who's like this Republican guy, I've never wanted to like hug a Republican like that. I mean, you know, he was so on these issues, but he wasn't thinking about it from a universal access or digital divide perspective. He was thinking about it from the perspective of jobs. But is there something about this issue that can unite those concerns about economic development and access in a way that is bipartisan, in a way that doesn't fit into the usual, you know, kinds of lines in which we all organize ourselves?
Well, you referenced Chattanooga. Chattanooga is that bipartisan example. Basically, they brought together the Republicans, the Democrats, people on welfare, and billionaires, and they brought them all together. But the focus was on internet as a utility, because the idea when they put together, I think, the $40 million referendum was it funded the electrical internet. So the idea was it was the internet so that they now can basically control their electrical utility, and then that supports green jobs. But once you put that infrastructure, they could then use it for communications infrastructure. As well, they had to fend off lawsuits by the incumbents against that. But basically the idea was, how do we go from a place
The incumbent company is providing those services, yeah.
And so the idea was, how do we basically reinvigorate Chattanooga, because it was where all the trains came together and created that kind of vibrant economy. Now the idea is that it's the urban cyberspace railroad, if you will, and that's the new way in which we bring that together to build our 21st century vibrant community.
So it's Democrats and Republicans united in being sued by telecom? Is that the, yep.
And remember that these are cities that already had municipal utilities that they could leverage for that. The only municipal utility essentially the city of New York has is water. So one of the things we need to look at is how we change our fundamental infrastructure of government in order to produce some of these solutions.
Do you want to answer to this?
I was going to just to give you an economic comment, which is that to get broadband in New York City, 97% of the city is actually covered by broadband. There's actually, you could actually apply if you had a house or a business to get broadband. But for residents, the minimal cost in New York, either Time Warner, Verizon, or in the Bronx Cablevision, is about $70 or $80 a month. You multiply that over the course of a year, you're talking about $800, $900, which is beyond the reach of most working class families to be able to access the internet. So it's not just the access in terms of physical, it's also the access in terms of economic.
But let's be clear that physical does not mean it goes all the way to the building.
Correct.
Right? We've got that last, from an infrastructure standpoint, we do still have that last mile problem.
Right. We still have to get from the street to the home or from the street into the building. And then because of New York City's old buildings, particularly around businesses, getting the fiber up into old buildings is really hard to do too.
And then I'm going to ask you, why ever would it get done? But let's go here.
Thank you all. My name is Robert Brill. I'm an attorney here in New York City, and I represent people involved with telecommunications in the city, really for the last 20 years. I'd like to ask you all, do you all agree that the way to provide more broadband, wireless broadband, and the like to the people of the city is through competition by those provisioning the service? Or do you believe that monopoly is as cogent a method as not? And finally, in that regard, the mayor's gave us a speech and he talked about competition, and he was extolling it at his keynote here. But the Wi-Fi initiative of the city, at least as DoIT has described it in a pre-bid, is going to be awarded to one provider. And if at a later date they're going to be competitors, the city will decide that. So I'd like you to comment on that.
And let's not go too deep into the inside baseball, but let's maybe just address, I think there's a question at the heart of that about the role of competition in
I think everybody on the panel agrees that we think competition is the way to go. But we also think that it's really bad when telcos and cable companies go into legislatures in states across the country and have laws passed that make it illegal for cities and states to offer broadband services directly to their citizens. New York doesn't happen to be one of those states, but across the country, the telco industry has basically blocked competition from happening, either because they've gone in and changed the law or because investors do not want to raise the money necessary to be able to successfully compete against Time Warner, Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, and others.
Well, as well, you have the recent decision in D.C., which basically gutted net neutrality. And that was Verizon who basically was responsible for that. So, I mean, you have a lot of issues that basically are eating away at the open internet.
The mayor spoke to competition. The mayor's statement stands, and we don't comment on open RFPs.
And just, I mean, I was struck by the mayors who we spoke with on Friday, Joey Durrell, for example, my new favorite guy, my best friend, the Republican from Louisiana, said, I begged the providers in my city to do what I needed them to do, which was to create universal, affordable access. And the incentive wasn't there for them to do it. So we had to do it. And so I think this issue of where universality and affordability meet is really the key kind of question motivating this conversation. Otherwise, considering that 98% of the city, as you said, Andrew, has access, the question would be, okay, well then why hasn't that translated into universal affordable access? And that's where we get into what is the incentive in order to be able to do that. So, but let's go back to the city though. So what's possible? I mean, I remember when I got this press release telling me that there was Wi-Fi in the park. I sat in the park and waited for Wi-Fi and waited for it, and I checked.
You didn't get your 10-minute slot?
Well,
I got a tan.
Yeah, but wait a second.
But I didn't get any
Andrew,
Wi-Fi. So what's happening?
So I just want to say, first of all, there's a lot we can do around wireless, and a lot is already happening. I mean, Harlem is getting the largest continuous wireless corridor in the country right now between 110th Street and 135th Street.
Did everybody get that? That Harlem's getting the biggest Wi-Fi network in the country?
What's happening in the park? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. We can celebrate a little bit. It's not all bad news. We're seeing tech incubators, but we're also looking at, we're exploring whether or not there's a possibility of having a gigabit innovation center, a gigabit speed innovation center. We don't have one yet in this city. When I talk about leveraging our libraries, we're actively partnering with the libraries to try to help them get the resources for what would be the first pilot of its kind in the country, which is to have a lending program for people who are largely low income in their libraries. Provide all kinds of services we don't know about. It's not just going in and getting a book, right? It's actually after school programs, computer literacy, programs for people who need to learn English as a second language. Those are folks who could benefit from a subscription service that is free to them, that enables them to get the services at home, not just come to the library to access the services. So those are the kinds of things we're doing now. And I think we can do a lot more wireless around the city, and that's not enough.
Yeah, I think
Andrew?
I was just going to say, I think we should, maybe for the audience, make people understand there's a difference between fiber broadband, coaxial broadband, which is Time Warner or what cable television comes to you, and wireless. So even if we had park Wi-Fi,
Right.
if everybody was on it at the same time, you wouldn't have enough capacity for everybody to be able to access the information that they need fast
Well, I
enough.
kicked everybody out of the park, but I was
Well,
still
and
waiting.
you can't obviously be the kid trying to do your homework in the middle of winter going to the park to get access to the internet.
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's important for the parks to be wired, and that needs to be expanded, and we can't see that as a solution.
So there's a multifaceted issue, but the city can do a lot. Working in partnership with the libraries, working in partnerships with organizations like the New York Tech Meetup to figure out ways to get technology distributed in inexpensive ways and into the hands of people who need it the most.
And before Bruce, ready your questions so we know where the mic goes.
I think also, I'm an engineer, and there's another way in which we can think about how the internet is configured. There's the ability to create nonprofit cooperatives that basically co-own their area of the internet, and then you hold the natural monopoly dormant, and then it's all about content applications and services. So for instance, as we see the rise of the tech sector in Harlem, there would be the ability to say, build this sort of network, and then it's all about the businesses that then are delivering services to their specific customer base. That's been done in places like Europe through a company called Packetfront. It hasn't been done here, but it's possible to put in place those sorts of economics when you have a fiber optic network, because you can channelize that network and you just have the dedicated bandwidth for that particular usage, but then you can also have the other key things that could be used for, such as all the hospitals being able to do radio logic technology.
Ari.
Hi there. My name is Ari. I'm the director of a NYC EDC program called Wired NYC. And we try to create transparency about the connectivity of commercial buildings and help landlords market the buildings that are well connected. If there's one thing I've learned through this program is that landlords often serve as the gatekeepers. If there's fiber out in the street, the landlord, whether residential or commercial, still needs to potentially take up some of the cost, or at least go through the legal arrangements to get that fiber in the building. Are there things that the city can be doing to either educate or incent landlords to actually get that fiber in the last mile?
Yeah, it's something we're actively talking about. So I don't have answers for you today, but you're absolutely right to raise the issue, and it's something we're considering.
Okay.
Another
Other questions? Other questions? Then here we go. Oh, two questions.
There's one over there.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to get
Hi, Ken Miles. I work for a health and wellness startup with a digital focus. My question is, I went to my first community board meeting the other day for the heck of it. I was getting really ticked off that fast food restaurants were going up in my community. So I went to the board meeting, and on a blog I had read maybe a week before, information was disseminated that wasn't addressed at the board meeting, right? So what I'm getting to is, it's not just speed online in terms of access, it's the speed of information, which is also power. So how do we actually bring the community, the folks who are invested in that information within the community, kind of up to speed, real time, so that they can make decisions that will impact, the broader community at large based on real-time information?
Alice?
I mean, that's a really good question.
I think we all agree that the city of New York has an extraordinary opportunity. As we worry about broadband, there's a couple of really great things that are happening. First of all, the cost of building websites, the use of social media, the use of mobile technologies has now become more and more ubiquitous. So even though you can't do your homework on a smartphone, you can still get a lot of information on a smartphone, and texting services and other services are now pretty ubiquitous. The question is whether New York City government can itself sort of reboot and start living a 21st century life and having relationships with its citizens the same way that we have relationships with each other in our businesses. So City council hearings, community board hearings are often inaccessible to many people because they're working class. So one of the great challenges is how can the city make the information that they need to know available, get their input, make them feel like they've been validated in participating, and helping them make decisions that affect their lives in a not an abstract way, but in a realistic way. That's a goal of this mayor, and that's a goal of this city. It doesn't happen overnight, but if you have any ideas about how that information can be distributed, send them on in.
And I would say the one thing that we're doing is looking at how we restructure the staffing of government in order to have more capacity to answer those kinds of questions. So that's why I say you're right to raise them. I can't sit here today and give you an answer except to say we're actually changing the way it's staffed.
Let's get in this last question here.
I actually work for a nonprofit that serves some of the most disadvantaged residents of our local community. I wanted to ask, how can nonprofits, government, and corporations work together to solve these problems?
What a wonderful question.
There's a great model in Red Hook. The Red Hook Initiative is a good example of a partnership between nonprofits. We're looking at how government can support more of that kind of model where you have a community organization. I mean, if you think about this, we have so many assets in the city. I mean, just like branch libraries, we've got nonprofits, we've got churches, we've got community-based organizations. There are ways for them to become distributors actually of wireless, of broadband, if we can figure out how to get the resourcing and capacity matches so that in places where folks are having trouble getting online, we create more opportunity. So I think that's a really good example of something that we're looking at, and I'm really glad you raised it.
Sarah, we only have 3 minutes to go.
We got
all
one more question.
Well, let's do this last question quickly, and then we'll close.
So is there a possibility of actually creating a physical hub where people can go and work instead of the
Yeah.
Starbucks?
Yes.
And
That's actually the gigabit. The idea behind exploring a gigabit like innovation center would be to see if we can do that. And I think see how we can also have other public resources like branch libraries be able to create more opportunities for that. So again, we're in exploration, but that is one of the key things that we can try to do.
the limitation of the library is, of course, being quiet doesn't allow for interaction among the people.
Right,
So
that's why
I was thinking of a
incubation
more
centers-
dedicated.
Right, which is
address-
why, you're right, which is why there are multiple different kinds of constituencies that can use different kinds of services. That's why the incubators that currently exist in different parts of the city are wonderful, and we can try to create more of those kinds of spaces. And we're looking at how can we also create more public space within them, so it's not just people who get accepted into a competition who are wonderful, but also have more of a public space for people to get that access. So you're right, and that's what we're thinking about.
I think also in response to that, earlier in this century, we had 136 community technology centers, and those were places where someone could go and access the internet. The issue was that they didn't have a sustainability model. And what happened was when the dot-com boom burst, a lot of the social and philanthropy that supported that, basically no longer could fund that. But as we build these co-working spaces, we also need to think about how we work with the local nonprofits and the universities, and we create these community technology centers with a sustainability model so that you can just basically walk in off the street and use them as a place to basically engage in your civic engagement activities, engage in what you want to do for your church. So that's another model that we should sort of look at, but we have to think about how to make them sustainable.
Can I add one thing that we're doing that I think is really important? So there are 7 computer centers right now in NYCHA housing, right? Public housing projects. They're computer centers. They do not have broadband access. We're going to get them lit.
Great.
Great.
So 15 seconds each to close. We've been talking a lot about what you're doing. So what can they do? So give me your quick thought to close for each of you on what this audience can do so that New York City has more universal and affordable broadband access.
Ideas, and also, quite frankly, we need you actively engaged in policy, because a lot of what we're talking about is also going to take some policy fights both at national level, maybe at state, I don't know yet. But if we don't have a vocal partnership, particularly with the tech sector, because I think the tech sector not only has direct interest, but recognizes how important this infrastructure is for the future of the city as a whole. I think there's a lot of partnership opportunities on making the kind of policies that get this infrastructure distributed and distributed fairly.
I think we as well have to have a 5-borough technology community that's not simply located in Digital Dumbo or in Silicon Alley. Not saying anything negative about those fantastic sectors, but it has to spread throughout the city so that it's ubiquitous broadband access for all, so that we all can have this kind of access to the social prosperity that it makes possible.
Andrew, what should this audience do?
So if there's one thing you could take away from this is to, when people ask you what about the future of New York, tell them that the most important thing that they can do is write to their congressmen, their city councilmen, their elected leaders, and tell them that they want to make sure that internet access is affordable and cheap and available to everyone, so that we can actually go from an era of e-government to an era of we government.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.